A kingdom of sinners and saints. Gianna Darasi had spent years forgetting her last name, hiding from the blood-soaked legacy she had abandoned. But when a man showed up at her small flower shop silent, towering, a scar running along his jaw, she knew her past had found her. He handed her a gun. "They killed your father," he said simply, his voice edged with quiet fury. "And now they're coming for you." Chapter 1. The scent of roses and gunpowder. The bell above the door of Fiore di Gianna jingled, a cheerful sound that usually brought a small smile to Gianna Darasi's face. Today, however, the sound felt jarring, like a discordant note in the quiet symphony of her carefully constructed life. She was arranging a bouquet of blood-red roses, their velvety petals soft beneath her fingertips, their scent a familiar comfort. For the past 15 years, this small flower shop in the heart of a quiet Boston neighborhood had been her sanctuary, a world away from the shadows of her past. She glanced up, expecting to see Mrs. O'Malley, her regular customer with a penchant for lilies, or perhaps young Mr. Henderson, who bought a single rose every Friday for his wife. Instead, a stranger stood framed in the doorway, a man who seemed to absorb the light, casting a long, imposing shadow across the colorful blooms. He was tall, undeniably so, with a breadth of shoulder that spoke of inherent strength. His hair was dark, almost black, and thick, swept back from a face that was both strikingly handsome and undeniably hard. A face that held stories, most of them likely unpleasant. But it was the scar that drew Gianna's gaze and held it captive. It ran from just below his left ear, tracing a jagged path down his jawline before disappearing beneath the crisp white collar of his shirt. It was an old scar, faded but not forgotten, a permanent reminder of a violence she had tried so hard to leave behind. The air in the shop, usually filled with the sweet fragrance of hyacinths and freesias, suddenly felt thick, heavy, almost suffocating. He didn't speak, didn't smile. He simply watched her, his eyes, the color of deep-sea slate, holding an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He moved with a quiet grace that belied his size, his steps measured and silent as he approached the counter. Gianna found herself instinctively taking a step back, her hand reaching for the small, ornate letter opener she kept hidden beneath the counter, a relic from her grandmother. A silly weapon, perhaps, but it was the only defense she had in this life she had built. He stopped just short of the counter, close enough that she could smell the faint, intriguing scent of him, a mix of expensive cologne, something subtly spicy, and an underlying, almost primal scent that reminded her of rain on hot pavement and something darker, something metallic. It was a scent that, despite her fear, stirred a long-dormant ember within her. He reached into the inner pocket of his impeccably tailored dark suit, a suit that screamed money and power, a stark contrast to the worn denim apron she wore, and withdrew something. Gianna's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She braced herself, her fingers tightening around the letter opener. But it wasn't a knife or a threat that he produced. It was a gun, a sleek, black, deadly-looking thing that lay heavy in his large hand. He placed it on the counter, the metal clinking softly against a polished wood, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the sudden silence of the shop. The roses, vibrant moments ago, seemed to droop, their crimson hue now a morbid foreshadowing. Gianna stared at the gun, her mind reeling. 15 years. 15 years she had spent burying her past, shedding the skin of Gianna Darasi, daughter of Antonio Darasi, capo of one of the most powerful mafia families in New York. 15 years she had spent becoming Gianna Rossi, florist, a woman who found solace in the gentle rustle of leaves and the vibrant colors of petals. 15 years of peace, shattered in an instant. The man finally spoke, his voice low and resonant, a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. It was a voice that carried the weight of authority, of command, but also something else. A weariness, perhaps, or a hint of regret. "They killed your father," he said simply, the words stark and brutal, devoid of any preamble or softening. Gianna's blood ran cold. Her father. Antonio. A man of iron will and ruthless ambition, a man who had ruled his empire with an iron fist, a man she had loved and feared in equal measure. A man she had run from, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of his world. She hadn't spoken to him in 15 years, hadn't even known if he was alive or dead. And now this. She found her voice, though it was barely a whisper, trembling with a mixture of fear and a grief she hadn't allowed herself to feel for years. Who killed him? The man's gaze didn't waver, his eyes locked on hers, holding her captive. The Salernos. The name hit her like a physical blow. The Salernos. The Derassi's oldest and most bitter rivals. A feud that stretched back generations, a blood feud fueled by betrayal, ambition, and a thirst for power. A feud she had thought she had escaped. And now, he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with a chilling certainty. They're coming for you. He gestured towards the gun. Take it. You'll need it. Gianna looked from the gun to the man's face, her mind struggling to comprehend the reality that had just crashed into her carefully constructed world. She was no longer Gianna Rossi, the quiet florist. She was Gianna de Rossi, once again, a pawn in a deadly game, a target in a war she had never wanted to be a part of. But as she looked into the stranger's eyes, she saw something flicker there, something beyond the cold calculation, beyond the threat. A flicker of protection? Or was it merely a reflection of her own desperate hope? She knew she had a choice to make. Run as she had done 15 years ago, disappear into another life, another identity. Or stand and face the ghosts of her past, the legacy she had tried to bury. The scent of the roses, now mingled with the metallic tang of the gun, filled her senses, a strange and unsettling combination. It was the scent of her past, and perhaps her future. A future she hadn't asked for, a future that was now unavoidable. The bell above the door, forgotten, seemed a distant memory. The only reality was the man, the gun, and the chilling words that hung in the air. They're coming for you. And in that moment, a spark of defiance, long dormant, ignited within her. She had run long enough. Chapter 2. Echoes of a Father's Legacy. Gianna reached out, her hand trembling almost imperceptibly, and picked up the gun. It was heavier than she expected, cold and unforgiving against her palm. She had never held a gun before, never even touched one. Her father had always kept that part of his life separate, a world she glimpsed only in hushed whispers and hurried meetings in his study, a room that always smelled of expensive cigars and something else, something indefinable that she now recognized as the scent of fear. I don't know how to use this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt foreign, clumsy, a betrayal of the independent woman she had become. The man didn't seem surprised. He simply nodded, his gaze unwavering. I'll teach you. His name, he told her, was Alessandro Bellini. He didn't offer explanations, didn't volunteer information about his connection to her father, to the family. He simply stated his name as a fact, a given. And somehow Gianna knew, instinctively, that he was telling the truth. There was a directness about him, a lack of artifice, that was both unsettling and strangely reassuring. He showed her how to hold the gun, how to load it, how to aim. His hands were large and calloused, his movements precise and efficient. He stood close to her, his body a warm, solid presence behind her, his breath stirring the fine hairs at the nape of her neck. She could feel the subtle tension in his muscles, the controlled power that emanated from him. It was a dangerous proximity, a reminder of the world she was being pulled back into, but it also felt safe. A contradiction that mirrored the turmoil within her. You have to be prepared, Alessandro said, his voice low and close to her ear, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. The Salernos are ruthless. They won't hesitate to kill you. Gianna closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the images that flooded her mind, images of her father, his face stern and unyielding, his eyes cold and calculating, images of the men who surrounded him, their faces shadowed, their hands always close to the weapons they carried, images of the violence that had always been a silent undercurrent in her life, a threat that had always hung in the air like a shroud. She opened her eyes, her gaze focusing on a single red rose, its petals unfurling in a perfect spiral. She had always found beauty in the smallest details, in the delicate curve of a petal, the subtle variations in color. It was a way of finding order in a chaotic world, a way of finding peace in the midst of turmoil. But now, even the beauty of the rose seemed tainted, overshadowed by the darkness that had descended upon her. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, turning to face him. It was a question that had been burning in her mind since he walked through the door. Alessandro met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Your father, he asked me to." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Asked him to. Not ordered, not commanded. Asked. It suggested a relationship that went beyond the usual hierarchy of the mafia, a relationship built on something more than just loyalty and obedience. It hinted at a debt, a promise, a bond that Gianna couldn't comprehend. He knew they would come after me?
Alessandro nodded.
He knew the Salernos. He knew their hatred. He knew they wouldn't stop until the de Rossi bloodline was extinguished. A chill ran through Gianna. Extinguished. The word echoed the finality of her father's death, the vulnerability of her own position. She was the last de Rossi, the last link to a legacy she had rejected, a legacy that was now threatening to consume her. "He never tried to contact me," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Not once in 15 years. Alessandro's gaze softened, just slightly. "He wanted to protect you. He knew that as long as you were away from him, away from the family, you were safe." "Safe?" Gianna laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "I was never safe. I was always looking over my shoulder, always afraid that the past would catch up to me. But you were alive," Alessandro countered, his voice firm. "And that's what mattered to him." Gianna didn't know what to believe. Her father had always been an enigma, a man of contradictions. He had been capable of great cruelty, but also of unexpected kindness. He had been a ruthless leader, but also a devoted father, in his own twisted way. She had spent years trying to reconcile those two sides of him, trying to understand the man who had shaped her life, even in his absence. "I need to know more," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I need to know what happened. I need to know why they killed him." Alessandro hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "It's a long story," he said finally, "and a complicated one." "I have time," Gianna said, her gaze meeting his, her resolve hardening. She was no longer the frightened florist, hiding from her past. She was Gianna de Rossi, and she was ready to face the truth, no matter how painful. The echoes of her father's legacy, once a distant rumble, were now a deafening roar. And she would not be silenced. She looked down at the gun in her hand, the cold steel a chilling reminder of what was to come. The shop, her sanctuary, felt different now. Vulnerable. She needed to leave.
Now.
Chapter 3. The serpent's shadow lengthens. "We need to go," Alessandro said, his voice urgent, breaking the tense silence that had fallen between them. "This place isn't safe." Gianna nodded, her mind already racing, trying to process the enormity of the situation. She quickly gathered a few essential items, a small bag, some cash she kept hidden in a locked drawer, a framed photograph of her mother, a woman she barely remembered but whose gentle smile had always been a source of comfort. She looked around the shop, her heart aching at the thought of leaving it behind, of abandoning the life she had so painstakingly built. But she knew there was no other choice. Alessandro led her out the back door, into a narrow alleyway that ran behind the shop. The air was cool and damp, the sky above a bruised purple, hinting at an approaching storm. The city sounds, the distant rumble of traffic, the wail of a siren seemed amplified, each sound a reminder of the danger that lurked around every corner. He had a car waiting, a sleek, black sedan that blended seamlessly into the shadows. It was a car that spoke of power and discretion, a car that belonged to the world she was being forced back into. As they drove, Alessandro remained silent, his eyes focused on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a controlled tension. Gianna watched him, trying to decipher the enigmatic man beside her. He was a mystery, a closed book, and yet she felt an undeniable pull towards him, a sense of trust that defied logic. They drove for what seemed like hours, the city lights blurring into a hazy glow. Gianna had no idea where they were going, but she trusted Alessandro, trusted his instincts, trusted the unspoken promise he had made to her father. Finally, they arrived at a large, imposing building in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. It was an old building, built of dark stone, with wrought iron balconies and tall, arched windows. It looked like a fortress, a place of refuge, but also a place of secrets. "This is my home," Alessandro said, his voice devoid of any inflection. "You'll be safe here." He led her inside, through a heavy oak door that opened into a grand foyer. The interior was surprisingly warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the building's austere exterior. The floors were polished marble, the walls adorned with antique tapestries and oil paintings. A large crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting a soft, golden light. It was a home that spoke of wealth and tradition, a home that belonged to a different world, a world Gianna had thought she had left behind forever. Alessandro showed her to a guest room, a spacious and elegantly furnished room with a large four-poster bed, a fireplace, and a private balcony overlooking a walled garden. It was a room that offered comfort and privacy, a room where she could finally breathe, if only for a little while. "Get some rest," Alessandro said, his voice gentle. "We'll talk in the morning." He left her alone, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Gianna stood in the middle of the room, feeling lost and overwhelmed. She was surrounded by luxury, by beauty, but all she could feel was a deep sense of unease, a gnawing fear that threatened to consume her. She walked over to the window and looked out at the garden. The storm had finally broken, the rain lashing against the glass, the wind howling like a tormented beast. The city lights were obscured by the downpour, creating an eerie, almost surreal atmosphere. It was as if the world outside was mirroring the turmoil within her. She thought of her father, of his death, of the Salerno's relentless pursuit. She thought of Alessandro, of his enigmatic presence, of his unwavering protection. She thought of the life she had lost, the life she had left behind, the life she was now being forced to confront. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill that had settled deep within her bones. She was alone, vulnerable, and afraid. But she was also a Derasi, and she would not be broken. She would not be defeated. She would survive. As she stood there, watching the storm rage outside, she noticed a shadow moving in the garden below. It was a fleeting glimpse, a flicker of movement, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through her. She strained her eyes, trying to see through the rain-streaked glass, but the shadow was gone. Was it just her imagination? Or was it a sign that the Salernos had already found her? The serpent's shadow, once a distant threat, was now lengthening, reaching out to ensnare her. And she knew that the night was far from over. She felt a sudden, almost overwhelming urge to see Alessandro, to feel his presence, to know that he was there. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Darkened City. Gianna found Alessandro in a large, dimly lit study, a room filled with bookshelves that reached from floor to ceiling. He was standing by a window, looking out at the storm, his back to her. He was no longer wearing his suit jacket, and his white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, revealed the strong column of his neck and a hint of the dark hair that dusted his chest. He held a glass of amber liquid in his hand, swirling it slowly, his thoughts seemingly miles away. She hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt his solitude. The room felt both intimate and imposing, a reflection of the man himself. The air was thick with the scent of old books, leather, and a faint trace of the same spicy cologne he wore, a scent that was already becoming familiar, almost comforting. He must have sensed her presence, because he turned, his eyes finding hers in the semi-darkness. He didn't seem surprised to see her, as if he had been expecting her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and husky, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. Gianna shook her head. "I saw something in the garden." "A shadow." Alessandro's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. It was probably just the storm, he said, his voice reassuring. But she sensed a subtle tension in his body, a readiness that belied his calm demeanor. Maybe, she said, unconvinced. She walked further into the room, drawn to him, to his strength, to the sense of safety he exuded, even in the midst of danger. He gestured towards a pair of leather armchairs facing the fireplace, where a low fire burned, casting flickering shadows on the walls.
Come, sit, he said. Tell me what you saw.
Gianna sat down, sinking into the soft leather, the warmth of the fire a welcome contrast to the chill that had settled deep within her. Alessandro sat opposite her, his gaze never leaving hers. She described the fleeting glimpse she had caught, the sense of unease that had gripped her. He listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "I'll check it out," he said finally. "But I doubt anyone could have gotten past the security." Gianna knew he was trying to reassure her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the Salernos were closer than they thought. "Tell me about my father," she said, changing the subject. She needed to know more, needed to understand the events that had led to his death, to her current predicament. Alessandro took a sip of his drink, his gaze drifting towards the fire. "He was a complicated man," he said, his voice tinged with a mixture of respect and regret. "He made a lot of enemies, but he also had a lot of loyalty. He was a force of nature." "And the Salernos?" Gianna pressed. "Why did they kill him?" Alessandro hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "It's a long story," he said, echoing his earlier words. "It goes back generations, to a feud that started over land, over power, over a woman." He began to tell her the story, a tale of betrayal and vengeance, of love and loss, of a blood feud that had spanned decades, claiming countless lives. He spoke of her grandfather, a man who had built the Derossi Empire from nothing, a man who had been both ruthless and charismatic. He spoke of the Salerno family, their rivals, their enemies, their constant threat. He spoke of the woman, Isabella, a beautiful and fiery woman who had been promised to her grandfather, but who had fallen in love with a Salerno. A forbidden love that had ignited the feud, a feud that had continued to burn, even after Isabella's death. As Alessandro spoke, Gianna began to understand the depth of the hatred, the complexity of the situation. It wasn't just about power, it wasn't just about money. It was about something more primal, something more deeply rooted in the past. It was about honor, about family, about a legacy of violence that had been passed down from generation to generation. "Your father tried to end the feud," Alessandro said, his voice softer now. "He tried to make peace with the Salernos. But they refused. They wanted revenge. They wanted the Derossi name erased from existence." Gianna felt a tear roll down her cheek. Her father, trying to find peace. And she was certain he had done it, at least in part, for her. "And now they're coming for me," she whispered, the reality of her situation hitting her with full force. She looked up and met his eyes in the dim light, noticing for the first time a fine network of lines around them, evidence of sleepless nights and burdens carried. He looked older than she had initially thought, and infinitely more weary. Alessandro nodded, his gaze unwavering. "But I won't let them," he said, his voice firm, his words a promise. "I swore to your father that I would protect you. And I will." The fire crackled, and in its flickering light, his eyes held something that looked remarkably like tenderness. A tenderness that both comforted and frightened her. Because tenderness, in this world, was often a prelude to pain. She heard the whispers outside, the rustling of leaves, the howl of the wind, each amplified, distorted, menacing. Or, perhaps, they weren't whispers at all. Chapter 5. A dance of deception and desire. The next few days passed in a strange, unsettling calm. Alessandro had reinforced the security around the house, adding extra guards, installing new surveillance equipment. He spent hours on the phone, speaking in hushed tones in Italian, his face grim, his body tense. Gianna tried to stay out of his way, occupying herself with exploring the house, reading books from his vast library, practicing with the gun he had given her. She was surprised by how quickly she adapted to the feel of the weapon, how natural it felt in her hand. It was a chilling realization, a reminder of the violence that was now a part of her life, but it also gave her a sense of empowerment, a feeling that she wasn't completely helpless. Alessandro taught her more than just how to use the gun. He taught her how to move, how to fight, how to defend herself. He pushed her hard, testing her limits, forcing her to confront her fears. He was a demanding teacher, but also a patient one, his eyes always watching her, assessing her, guiding her. Their training sessions were intense, physically and emotionally charged. They moved together in a dangerous dance, their bodies close, their breaths mingling. Gianna was acutely aware of Alessandro's strength, of his power, of the subtle scent of his skin. It was a dangerous attraction, a forbidden desire, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt towards him. He, in turn, seemed to be affected as well. Sometimes, when their hands brushed or their eyes met, she saw a flicker of something in his gaze, something that mirrored her own longing. But he always pulled back, erecting a wall between them, a reminder of the circumstances, of the danger that surrounded them. One evening, after a particularly grueling training session, they found themselves in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal together. It was a surprisingly domestic scene, a moment of normalcy in the midst of the chaos. Gianna was chopping vegetables, while Alessandro was stirring a pot of sauce on the stove, the air filled with the fragrant aroma of garlic, basil, and tomatoes. "You're a good cook," Gianna said, smiling. It was the first genuine smile she had felt in days. Alessandro glanced at her, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "My grandmother taught me," he said. She believed that a man should know how to cook, just as he should know how to fight. Gianna laughed, a light, airy sound that surprised even her. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Alessandro said, his voice softening. "She was the heart of our family." They fell silent, the only sound the gentle simmering of the sauce. Gianna felt a connection to him in that moment, a shared understanding that went beyond words. They were both survivors, both shaped by their families, by their legacies. As they ate, they talked, not about the mafia, not about the Salernos, but about their lives, their dreams, their hopes. Gianna told him about her flower shop, about her love of nature, about her desire to create beauty in the world. Alessandro told her about his childhood, about his love of history, about his desire to preserve the past. It was a conversation that felt both ordinary and extraordinary, a glimpse of the people they might have been, if not for the circumstances that had brought them together. It was a conversation that deepened the connection between them, a connection that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Later that night, Gianna found herself unable to sleep. She tossed and turned in the large bed, her mind racing, her body restless. She got up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. The storm had passed, and the sky was clear, the stars shining brightly. She saw a figure moving in the garden below, and her heart skipped a beat. It was Alessandro. He was standing by the rose bushes, his head bowed, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked lost, vulnerable, a stark contrast to the strong, imposing man she had come to know. She couldn't resist the urge to go to him. She slipped out of her room and made her way down to the garden, her footsteps silent on the dew-kissed grass. She approached him slowly, her heart pounding in her chest.
"Alessandro?"
she said softly. He turned, his eyes meeting hers in the moonlight. He looked surprised to see her, but not displeased. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Neither could I," he said, his voice husky. They stood there for a moment, in silence, the only sound the gentle rustling of the leaves. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, with a tension that was both electric and agonizing. Gianna felt drawn to him, irresistibly, her body aching for his touch. She knew it was wrong, knew it was dangerous, but she couldn't help herself. A deception, perhaps to herself, that he was a safe harbor. She was dancing along the edge of a precipice, a thrilling, terrifying dance with a man who was both her protector and a potential threat. A man who held her father's secrets, and perhaps, the key to her own heart. The moonlight illuminated the garden, revealing not only the roses, but the subtle tremor in Alessandro's hands. Chapter 6. Blood Ties and Broken Vows. Gianna took a step closer, her hand reaching out, almost involuntarily, to touch his arm. The fabric of his shirt was soft beneath her fingertips, the warmth of his skin radiating through. He didn't pull away, didn't flinch. He simply looked at her, his eyes dark and intense, searching hers. "What are you thinking?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He hesitated, as if struggling with his own internal demons. "I'm thinking that this is wrong," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "That we shouldn't." He didn't finish the sentence, but Gianna understood. He was thinking about her father, about the promise he had made, about the danger that surrounded them. He was thinking about the code, the unwritten rules of the Mafia, the rules that forbade relationships between protectors and those they were sworn to protect. But Gianna didn't care about the rules. She didn't care about the danger. All she cared about was the man standing before her, the man who had shown her kindness, strength, and a vulnerability that mirrored her own. "I don't care," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. She took another step closer, closing the distance between them. She could feel his breath on her face, smell the intoxicating scent of his skin. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jawline. His touch was electric, sending shivers down her spine. "Gianna," he said, her name a sigh, a plea, a warning. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was playing with fire, knew she was risking everything, but she couldn't stop herself. She was drawn to him, irresistibly, her body aching for his embrace. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch. It was a soft kiss, a gentle exploration, a moment of pure, unadulterated longing. Gianna responded, her lips parting beneath his, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent. It was a kiss that spoke of years of repressed desire, of forbidden longing, of a connection that defied logic and reason. It was a kiss that erased the boundaries between them, a kiss that shattered the rules, a kiss that sealed their fate. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked, their hearts pounding in unison. They stood there, in the moonlight, surrounded by the fragrant roses, the silence heavy with unspoken emotions. "We can't," Alessandro said, his voice hoarse, his eyes filled with regret. "We can't do this." Gianna knew he was right, but she also knew that she couldn't deny the feelings that had been growing between them, the feelings that had now exploded into a passionate inferno. "I know," she said, her voice trembling, "but I don't want to stop." He looked at her, his expression torn between desire and duty. He was a man caught between two worlds, between his loyalty to her father and his love for her. Suddenly, a sound shattered the silence, the sharp crack of a twig breaking. They both froze, their bodies tensing, their senses on high alert. Alessandro pushed Gianna behind him, his hand reaching for the gun he always carried, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice low and menacing. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man dressed in black, his face obscured by a ski mask. He held a gun in his hand, pointed directly at them. Well, the man said, his voice muffled by the mask. "Look what we have here." The lost Derossi princess and her loyal bodyguard. Gianna recognized the voice. It was Marco Salerno, the son of her father's killer, the man who was now hunting her. "Marco," Alessandro said, his voice cold and steady. "What a pleasant surprise." "I'm here for the girl." "Bellini," Marco said, his voice dripping with venom. "Step aside, and I might let you live." Alessandro didn't move. He stood his ground, his body shielding Gianna's, his eyes locked on Marco's. "You'll have to go through me," he said, his voice a deadly promise. Marco laughed, a harsh, brittle sound.
"So be it," he said.
He raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. The broken vows of family loyalty and the unspoken promises of love were about to collide in a shower of violence. The blood ties, severed and betrayed, demanded retribution. Gianna felt, rather than saw, Alessandro tense, preparing for the inevitable. Chapter 7. The Weight of Unspoken Truths. Before Marco could fire, a shot rang out, not from his gun, but from somewhere behind him. Marco stumbled, his eyes widening in surprise, his gun clattering to the ground. He turned, slowly, to face his attacker, a look of disbelief on his face. Another figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, tall and slender, her face hidden by the darkness. She held a gun in her hand, the barrel still smoking. Gianna gasped, recognizing the woman, even in the dim light. It was Isabella Rossi, Alessandro's sister, a woman she had only met briefly, a woman who was known for her beauty and her ruthlessness. "Isabella?" Alessandro said, his voice a mixture of surprise and relief. Isabella didn't answer. She kept her gun trained on Marco, her eyes cold and unwavering. Marco, wounded and disarmed, glared at her, his face contorted with rage and pain. You betrayed me?" he stammered, his voice weak. Isabella smiled, a cruel, chilling smile. "Betrayal is a family tradition, Marco," she said. "You should know that by now." She fired again, this time hitting Marco in the leg. He screamed, collapsing to the ground, clutching his wound. Isabella walked towards him, her gun still pointed at him, her movements slow and deliberate. "Any last words?" she asked, her voice devoid of any emotion. Marco spat on the ground, his eyes filled with hatred. "You'll pay for this," he hissed. "My family will avenge me." Isabella laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Your family is finished, Marco," she said. "Just like yours." She was about to fire again, when Alessandro intervened.
"Isabella, no,"
he said, his voice sharp. "That's enough." Isabella hesitated, her fingers still on the trigger. She looked at Alessandro, her eyes questioning. "We don't kill unarmed men," Alessandro said, his voice firm. "That's not our way." Isabella lowered her gun, reluctantly. "He's a Salerno," she said, her voice cold.
"He deserves to die."
"He'll be dealt with," Alessandro said. "But not like this." He turned to Gianna, who was standing behind him, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. Gianna nodded, unable to speak. She was still reeling from the events that had just transpired, from the violence, from the betrayal, from the near-death experience. Alessandro turned back to Isabella.
"Take him," he said.
"And make sure he doesn't escape." Isabella nodded, her expression grim. She called for two of the guards, who quickly appeared and dragged Marco away, his screams echoing in the night. Alessandro and Gianna were left alone, the silence broken only by the sound of their breathing. Gianna looked at Alessandro, her eyes filled with questions. "Isabella, she's one of you?" she asked, her voice trembling.
Alessandro nodded.
"She's my sister," he said. "And she's part of the family." Gianna didn't understand. She had thought Alessandro was different, that he was separate from the violence, from the darkness. But now, she realized that he was deeply embedded in it, that he was a part of the world she had tried so hard to escape. And his sister.
Part of that family.
Not the one of comforting blood ties, but of the other. I need some time," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to process this." She turned and walked away, leaving Alessandro standing alone in the garden, the weight of unspoken truths hanging heavy in the air. She went back to her room, the image of Marco's bleeding body, of Isabella's cold eyes, of Alessandro's conflicted expression, burned into her mind. The weight of her father's legacy, of Alessandro's deception, of the violence that surrounded her, was almost too much to bear. She felt betrayed, confused, and more alone than ever. She needed answers, and she needed them now. But more than that, a chilling thought crept into her mind. How many more layers of deception were there? Chapter 8. Sanctuary in a Stranger's Arms. Gianna didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the evening, the images of violence and betrayal swirling in her head. She felt a profound sense of disillusionment, a feeling that the world she had known, the world she had believed in, was crumbling around her. She had trusted Alessandro, had allowed herself to be drawn to him, to feel something for him. And now, she realized that he was not who she thought he was. He was a part of the mafia, a part of the violence, a part of the darkness. He had lied to her, or at the very least had omitted crucial truths. She got up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. The first rays of dawn were beginning to paint the sky with hues of pink and orange, a beautiful sunrise that contrasted sharply with the turmoil within her. She needed to get away, to clear her head, to think. She couldn't stay in this house, surrounded by secrets and lies. She needed to be alone, to find some semblance of peace, to decide what to do next. She quickly dressed, putting on the same clothes she had worn the day before. She grabbed the small bag she had packed, the photograph of her mother, and the gun Alessandro had given her. She hesitated for a moment, looking at the gun. It was a symbol of the violence she was trying to escape, but it was also a symbol of protection, a reminder that she wasn't completely helpless. She slipped out of her room, making her way down the stairs and out the back door, the same way she had come in. She walked quickly, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay here. She walked for hours, through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, past the elegant homes and manicured gardens. She eventually found herself in a small park, a green oasis in the midst of the concrete jungle. She sat down on a bench, beneath a large oak tree, her body aching, her mind exhausted. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise of the city, the memories of the night before. She tried to focus on the sounds of nature, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, the gentle breeze on her face. She thought of her mother, of her gentle smile, of her quiet strength. She wished she could talk to her, ask for her advice, for her guidance. She felt a deep sense of longing, a yearning for a connection that was lost forever. She opened her eyes, her gaze focusing on a small patch of wildflowers growing near the base of the tree. They were delicate and beautiful, their colors vibrant against the green grass. She remembered her flower shop, the scent of roses and lilies, the feeling of creating beauty with her own hands. She realized that she missed it, missed the simplicity, the peace, the normalcy of that life. She missed being Gianna Rossi, the florist, the woman who had found solace in nature, in beauty, in creating something good in the world. But she knew she couldn't go back. She was Gianna Rossi whether she liked it or not. And she had a responsibility, a duty, to face her past, to confront the demons that haunted her. Suddenly, she heard a voice, a familiar voice calling her name. She turned, her heart skipping a beat. It was Alessandro. He was standing at the edge of the park, his eyes searching for her. He looked worried, relieved, and something else. Something that looked like love. He walked towards her, his steps slow and hesitant. "Gianna," he said, his voice soft. "I was worried. I didn't know where you had gone." She didn't answer. She simply looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger, hurt, and yes, still love. The sanctuary she craved, ironically, seemed to reside in the arms of the stranger who was no longer a stranger, but a complex, dangerous man she was inextricably bound to. The arms that held a gun now reached out, not in violence, but in a desperate plea. Chapter 9. Scars that tell 1,000 stories. Alessandro sat down beside her on the bench, keeping a respectful distance, his hands clasped in his lap. He didn't try to touch her, didn't try to force a conversation. He simply waited, giving her the space she needed. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. The city sounds, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of them, alone in their shared turmoil. Finally, Gianna spoke, her voice low and trembling. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her eyes accusing. "About your sister, about your family, about who you really are?" Alessandro sighed, his gaze drifting towards the ground. I wanted to, he said, his voice raw with honesty. But I was afraid. Afraid of what? Gianna pressed. Afraid that I would run? Afraid that I wouldn't understand? Afraid of losing you, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that she had never seen before. From the moment I saw you in that flower shop, I knew that you were different, that you were special, and I didn't want to scare you away. Gianna felt a pang of guilt, a flicker of understanding. She had been so focused on her own fear, on her own pain, that she hadn't considered his. She had judged him, condemned him, without knowing the full story. Tell me, she said, her voice softer now. Tell me everything.
Alessandro nodded.
He began to tell her his story, a story that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. He told her about his childhood, about growing up in the shadow of the mafia, about the violence he had witnessed, the choices he had been forced to make. He told her about his father, a man who had been both a loving father and a ruthless capo, a man who had tried to shield Alessandro from the darkness, but who had ultimately failed. He told her about his mother, a woman who had died when he was young, a woman who had always been his moral compass, his guiding light. He told her about Isabella, his sister, a woman who had been forced to grow up too fast, a woman who had learned to fight, to survive, in a world dominated by men. A woman who had chosen a different path, a path of violence and power, a path that Alessandro had always tried to avoid. I never wanted this life, Alessandro said, his voice filled with regret. I wanted to be different, to be better. I wanted to be worthy of you. He reached out, his hand gently touching hers. His touch was warm and comforting, a stark contrast to the coldness of the gun she still carried in her bag. I know I made a mistake, he said. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. But I was afraid of losing you. And now I'm afraid it's too late. Gianna looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the pain, the regret, the vulnerability. But she also saw the strength, the kindness, the love. She saw the man she had fallen for, the man who had protected her, the man who had shown her a different side of himself. She realized that she still loved him, despite everything. She loved him for his flaws, for his complexities, for his humanity. She loved him for the scars that told 1,000 stories, the scars that were both physical and emotional. She took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. It's not too late, she said, her voice firm.
But you need to be honest with me.
Always. He nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. I will, he said. I promise. They sat there, in silence, their hands clasped together, a connection restored, a trust rebuilt. The sun was rising higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the park, over the city, over the two of them. The scars, both visible and hidden, were a testament to their past, but they also represented a shared future, a future they would face together. Gianna leaned her head on his shoulder, a gesture of trust, of forgiveness, of love. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of hope, a sense of belonging. But even in that moment of peace, a nagging question lingered. Could she truly trust him completely? Chapter 10. A glimmer of hope in the abyss. The tentative peace that settled between Gianna and Alessandro was fragile, a delicate flower blooming in the harsh landscape of their reality. They returned to Alessandro's house, the unspoken agreement hanging in the air they would face this together, but the path ahead was still shrouded in uncertainty. Alessandro started to open up, sharing details about the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that define the mafia world. He explained the nuances of the code, the omerta, the twisted sense of honor that governed their actions. He didn't shy away from the brutality, the violence, but he also emphasized the importance of loyalty, of family, of protecting those they cared about. Gianna listened, absorbing the information, trying to reconcile the man she loved with the world he inhabited. She began to understand the pressures he faced, the choices he had been forced to make, the constant threat that hung over him. She saw the burden he carried, the weight of responsibility, the constant struggle between his conscience and his duty. One afternoon, Alessandro took her to a small, hidden room in the basement of the house. It was a vault filled with documents, photographs, and artifacts that chronicled the history of the de Rossi family. He showed her pictures of her father, of her grandfather, of generations of de Rossis who had lived and died by the code. He showed her a faded photograph of her mother, a woman she barely remembered. She was beautiful, with a gentle smile and kind eyes, a stark contrast to the stern faces of the men who surrounded her. Gianna felt a pang of sadness, a longing for a connection that was lost forever. "Your mother was a good woman," Alessandro said, his voice soft. "She tried to keep you away from all this. She wanted a different life for you." Gianna nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I know," she said, "and I tried to honor her wishes." Alessandro put his arm around her, a gesture of comfort and support.
"You did," he said. "And you still can.
"We can find a way out of this, Gianna. Together." His words gave her hope, a glimmer of light in the abyss of darkness that surrounded them. She clung to that hope, to the belief that they could escape the cycle of violence, that they could create a different future for themselves. But the peace was short-lived. One evening, while they were having dinner, Alessandro received a phone call. He listened intently, his face growing grim, his body tensing. He spoke in rapid Italian, his voice low and urgent. He hung up the phone, his expression grave.
"It's the Salernos," he said.
"They're planning something. Something big." Gianna felt a chill run through her. The threat was no longer abstract, no longer a distant shadow. It was real, it was imminent, it was closing in. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alessandro looked at her, his eyes filled with determination.
"We're going to fight," he said.
"We're going to protect ourselves. And we're going to end this, once and for all." He began to make preparations, gathering his men, securing the house, preparing for war. Gianna watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. She saw the leader in him, the warrior, the man who was willing to risk everything to protect those he loved. She offered to help, her hands steady now as she insisted on checking the ammunition for the weapons Alessandro distributed to his men. It was a small task, but it was a statement. She wouldn't be a passive bystander. She would fight alongside him. The glimmer of hope, fragile as it was, illuminated the abyss, casting long shadows that danced with both fear and determination. It was a hope born of love, fueled by loyalty, and tempered by the harsh reality of their world. A hope that, against all odds, they might just survive. Chapter 11. Betrayal's bitter sting. The tension in the house was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered every conversation, every movement. Alessandro's men, a collection of hardened faces and watchful eyes, moved with a quiet urgency, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the Salernos. Gianna, despite her determination to be a part of the fight, felt increasingly like an outsider, a witness to a world she still didn't fully understand. Alessandro, preoccupied with the impending threat, became more distant, his focus narrowed to the strategic planning, the logistics of war. He was still kind, still protective, but the intimacy they had shared, the tentative connection they had forged, seemed to be fading, replaced by a cold, hard reality. One evening, Gianna found herself alone in the study, drawn to the room's quiet solitude, to the scent of old books and leather that reminded her of Alessandro. She was looking at the photographs on his desk, a collection of images that chronicled his life, his family, his world. She picked up a photograph of Alessandro and Isabella, standing side by side, their arms around each other, their smiles genuine and carefree. It was a picture from their younger days, before the weight of the world had settled on their shoulders. Gianna felt a pang of jealousy, a feeling of exclusion. She realized that she would never truly be a part of their world, never fully understand the bond they shared, the history that connected them. As she was putting the photograph back, she noticed a small, folded piece of paper tucked beneath it. She hesitated for a moment, her conscience warring with her curiosity. But the need to know, to understand, to bridge the gap between them, was too strong to resist. She unfolded the paper, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a letter, written in Italian, in a handwriting she didn't recognize. She scanned the letter, her Italian rusty but sufficient, her eyes widening in disbelief as she deciphered the words. The letter was addressed to Alessandro, from someone named Sofia. It was a love letter, a passionate, intimate letter, filled with longing and desire. Sofia wrote about their secret meetings, their stolen moments, their shared dreams. She wrote about her fear of discovery, her fear of the consequences, but also about her unwavering love for Alessandro. Gianna felt a sharp pain in her chest, a feeling of betrayal so profound that it took her breath away. She read the letter again, and again, each word a dagger twisting in her heart. She couldn't believe it. Alessandro, the man she loved, the man she had trusted, had been lying to her, deceiving her. She heard footsteps approaching, and she quickly folded the letter, putting it back where she had found it. Alessandro entered the study, his face etched with worry. "Gianna," he said, his voice soft. "What are you doing here?" She couldn't look at him. She couldn't speak. She felt numb, her mind reeling, her heart shattered. He came closer, his hand reaching out to touch her arm. She flinched, recoiling from his touch. "What's wrong?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. She looked at him then, her eyes filled with tears, with anger, with betrayal. "Who is Sofia?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alessandro's face paled. He froze, his eyes widening in shock, in realization. He knew that she had found the letter. "Gianna, I can explain," he stammered, his voice faltering. But Gianna didn't want to hear his explanations. She didn't want to hear his lies. She had heard enough. The bitter sting of betrayal poisoned everything, turning the glimmer of hope into a cruel illusion. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, alone, the weight of his deception hanging heavy in the air. The trust, so carefully rebuilt, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. And the sound of the approaching storm was no longer just the weather. Chapter 12. The Price of Loyalty and Love. Gianna fled to her room, locking the door behind her, her body shaking, her heart aching with a pain she had never felt before. She paced the room, her mind racing, her emotions a chaotic storm of anger, hurt, and disbelief. She felt like a fool, a naive, trusting fool who had allowed herself to be deceived, to be manipulated. She had opened her heart to Alessandro, had given him her trust, her love, and he had betrayed her. He had lied to her, kept secrets from her, all while pretending to care for her, to protect her. She thought of Sofia, the woman in the letter, the woman who shared Alessandro's secret life, his secret love. She imagined them together, their stolen moments, their shared dreams, and a wave of jealousy, of rage, washed over her. She wanted to scream, to cry, to lash out, to break something. But she couldn't. She had to be strong, had to be in control, had to think. She couldn't let her emotions cloud her judgment, couldn't let her pain dictate her actions. She sat down on the bed, her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She closed her eyes, trying to calm herself, to find some semblance of peace, of clarity. She thought of her father, of his legacy, of the world she had been born into. She thought of Alessandro, of his complexities, of his contradictions, of the love she had felt for him. She thought of Sofia, of the secret that had shattered her trust, of the betrayal that had broken her heart. She realized that she had a choice to make. She could run, as she had done before, disappear into another life, another identity. Or she could stay and confront the situation, confront Alessandro, confront the truth. She knew that running would be easier, that it would be the safer option. But she also knew that she couldn't run anymore. She couldn't keep hiding from her past, from her feelings, from herself. She had to stay. She had to fight. For herself, for her father, for the future she wanted, for the love she had lost, for the truth she deserved. She got up, her resolve hardening, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. She walked over to the mirror, looking at her reflection. She saw a woman who had been broken, a woman who had been betrayed, but also a woman who was strong, a woman who was resilient, a woman who was ready to fight. She heard a knock on the door, a hesitant, tentative knock. It was Alessandro. "Gianna," he said, his voice soft, pleading. "Please, let me in. Let me explain." She didn't answer. She stood there, silent, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that she had to face him, had to hear his explanation, but she also knew that she couldn't trust him, couldn't let him manipulate her again. The price of loyalty, she was learning, was often paid in heartache. And the price of love, in this world, could be deadly. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She walked over to the door, her hand reaching for the knob. The cold metal was a stark reminder of the coldness that had settled in her heart. But beneath the coldness, a flicker of something else remained. Hope. Or merely the embers of a love that refused to die. She wasn't sure. But she knew one thing. She was ready to face whatever awaited her on the other side of that door. She opened the door. Chapter 13. Unmasking the Enemy Within. Alessandro stood in the hallway, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret, desperation, and fear. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single night. He held his hands out, palms up, a gesture of supplication, of surrender. "Gianna," he began, his voice hoarse. "Please, you have to believe me. It's not what you think." Gianna stood her ground, her arms crossed, her expression unyielding. "Then tell me," she said, her voice cold and steady. "Tell me what it is." Alessandro hesitated, his gaze shifting, his body tensing. He looked like a trapped animal, desperate to escape, but knowing that there was no way out. "Sophia, he stammered, his voice faltering. "She's my cousin." Gianna's eyes widened in disbelief. "Your cousin?" she repeated, her voice laced with skepticism. "That letter, it was a love letter. A passionate, intimate love letter." Alessandro shook his head, his eyes pleading. "It was a code," he said. "A way of communicating. We had to be careful. The Salernos, they have spies everywhere. They were watching us." Gianna felt a flicker of doubt, a seed of uncertainty. Could it be true? Could the letter have been a deception, a way of hiding something else? "Explain," she said, her voice demanding. Alessandro took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping, as if he was carrying the weight of the world. He began to tell her the story, a story that was even more complicated, more twisted than she could have imagined. He explained that Sophia was not just his cousin, but also a key figure in a rival mafia family, the Morettis. The Morettis were a powerful family, with a long-standing feud with the Salernos. Alessandro and Sophia had been working together, secretly, to undermine the Salernos, to gather information, to prepare for a final confrontation. The letter, it was a way of passing information, Alessandro said. The love, it was a metaphor for the alliance, for the shared goal. The secret meetings, they were meetings with informants, with allies. The dreams, they were plans, strategies. Gianna listened, her mind struggling to process the information. It was a plausible explanation, a logical explanation, but she still felt a knot of unease in her stomach. Something didn't feel right. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice accusing. "Why keep it a secret?" Alessandro looked down, his expression filled with shame. "I was afraid," he said. "Afraid that you wouldn't understand. Afraid that you would leave me. And afraid that the Salernos would find out. If they knew about Sophia, about our plan, they would have killed her. They would have killed us both." Gianna felt a wave of sympathy for him, a flicker of understanding. She knew what it was like to be afraid, to be forced to make difficult choices, to live in a world of secrets and lies. But still, a part of her doubted him. A part of her couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something, that he was still deceiving her. The enemy, she was beginning to suspect, wasn't just the Salernos. It was lurking closer, hidden beneath layers of family loyalty, twisted alliances, and unspoken truths. "Show me," she said, her voice firm. "Show me proof." Alessandro looked surprised, then met her gaze, respect and something else, perhaps relief dawning in his eyes. Chapter 14. A Reckoning Under the Moonlit Sky. Alessandro led Gianna back to the study, to the vault where he kept the Derossi family records. He opened a hidden compartment, revealing a stack of documents, photographs, and coded messages. He showed her the evidence, piece by piece, meticulously explaining the intricate web of alliances, betrayals, and counter-betrayals that define the mafia underworld. He showed her the real correspondence between him and Sofia, coded messages that used flowers as a cipher. Roses represented the Salernos, lilies represented the Morettis, and other flowers represented various individuals and locations. The seemingly innocent love letter was, in fact, a detailed plan to expose a network of corrupt officials who were working with the Salernos. He showed her photographs of secret meetings, surveillance reports, and financial records that documented the Salernos' illegal activities. He explained how he and Sofia had been working together for months to gather the evidence they needed to bring down the Salerno empire. As Gianna listened, as she saw the evidence with her own eyes, her doubts began to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of understanding, of admiration, of respect. She realized that Alessandro had been telling the truth, that he had been protecting her, not just from the Salernos, but also from the truth, a truth that was too dangerous, too complicated to share. She saw the burden he had been carrying, the weight of responsibility, the constant fear of discovery. She saw the sacrifices he had made, the risks he had taken to protect his family, to protect his allies, to protect her. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry I doubted you." Alessandro reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb wiping away a tear. "It's all right," he said, his voice husky. "I understand. I should have told you sooner." They stood there, in silence, their eyes locked, a connection restored, a trust rebuilt, stronger than before. The weight of the secrets, of the lies, had been lifted, replaced by a shared understanding, a shared purpose. Gianna was no longer a pawn, and no longer ignorant of the game. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from downstairs, followed by the sound of shouting, of gunfire. They both froze, their bodies tensing, their senses on high alert. "The Salernos," Alessandro said, his voice grim. "They're here." He grabbed a gun from the vault, handing another to Gianna. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice firm.
"And be ready."
They moved quickly, silently, through the darkened house, towards the source of the commotion. They found themselves in the grand foyer, where a fierce battle was raging. Alessandro's men were engaged in a firefight with a group of Salerno assassins, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the deafening sound of gunfire. Alessandro and Gianna joined the fight, their movements synchronized, their instincts honed by weeks of training. They fought side by side, protecting each other, their love a shield against the hatred that surrounded them. As they fought, Gianna saw a figure emerge from the shadows, a man she recognized. It was Marco Salerno, his face contorted with rage, his eyes burning with vengeance. He was holding a gun, pointed directly at Alessandro. Without thinking, Gianna raised her gun and fired. The shot hit Marco in the shoulder, knocking him off balance, his gun flying from his hand. He fell to the ground, clutching his wound, his eyes filled with shock, with disbelief. Alessandro looked at Gianna, his eyes filled with gratitude, with love. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her courage, of her loyalty, of her strength. The fight continued, but the tide had turned. Alessandro's men, fueled by their loyalty, by their determination, by the presence of Gianna, fought with renewed vigor. The Salerno assassins, outnumbered and outmatched, began to retreat, disappearing back into the shadows. The reckoning had begun, under the cold, uncaring light of the moon. And the lines between enemy and ally, between love and hate, blurred in the chaos of the battle. Chapter 15. Flames of Rebellion and Redemption. The remaining Salerno assassins fled, leaving behind a scene of carnage and destruction. The grand foyer, once a symbol of elegance and power, was now littered with broken furniture, shattered glass, and the bodies of the fallen. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, a grim reminder of the violence that had erupted. Alessandro quickly assessed the situation, checking on his men, ensuring that everyone was accounted for. He found Gianna standing over Marco Salerno, her gun still trained on him, her face pale but resolute. Marco was wounded, bleeding, but still alive. He looked up at Gianna, his eyes filled with hatred, with defiance. You won't get away with this, he hissed, his voice weak. My family, they will avenge me. Gianna didn't answer. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. She felt a mixture of emotions: anger, fear, sadness, but also a strange sense of pity. She saw the man he was, the product of a violent world, a pawn in a deadly game. Alessandro came to her side, his hand gently touching her arm. Let him go, he said, his voice soft. He's finished. Gianna hesitated, her fingers still on the trigger. She wanted to end it, to eliminate the threat, to avenge her father, to protect herself, to protect Alessandro. But she couldn't. She couldn't bring herself to kill a wounded, defenseless man. She lowered her gun, her hand trembling. Take him, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Get him out of here. Alessandro nodded, understanding. He called for two of his men, who quickly dragged Marco away, his screams of protest echoing in the night. Alessandro turned to Gianna, his eyes filled with admiration, with love. You did the right thing, he said. You're stronger than you think. Gianna leaned against him, her body shaking, her emotions overwhelming. She felt exhausted, drained, but also a strange sense of peace. She had faced her fears, had confronted her demons, had made a choice. And she had chosen mercy over vengeance. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of the situation sank in. The house was damaged, several of Alessandro's men were injured, and the threat of the Salernos, while diminished, was not entirely gone. This was a rebellion, a turning point, but not yet a victory. Suddenly, they heard a shout from outside, followed by the sound of sirens, growing closer. The police, Alessandro said, his face grim. Someone must have called them. He knew that they couldn't stay here. The police would investigate, would ask questions, would uncover secrets. They had to leave, to disappear, to find a safe place. We need to go, he said, his voice urgent.
Now.
He grabbed her hand, and they ran, out the back door, into the night. They ran through the darkened streets, the sound of sirens chasing them, the flames of rebellion burning bright in their hearts. They were fugitives, hunted, but they were also free. Free from the past, free from the lies, free to choose their own destiny. They ran towards an uncertain future, a future filled with danger, with challenges, but also with hope. A hope for a new life, a new beginning, a redemption earned through courage, through loyalty, through love. As they ran, Gianna looked back at the house, now engulfed in shadows, a symbol of the world they were leaving behind. The flames of rebellion, ignited by the night's events, were mirrored by a different kind of fire, a fire of redemption, burning within her own soul. But where would they run to? And who had called the police? Chapter 16. Crossroads of Fate and Forgiveness. Alessandro led Gianna to a hidden garage several blocks away from his house. Inside, a sleek, black motorcycle waited, gleaming under the dim fluorescent lights. It was a powerful machine, built for speed and escape. We'll take this, Alessandro said, his voice calm and decisive. It's faster, more maneuverable. Gianna nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never ridden a motorcycle before, but she trusted Alessandro, trusted his instincts, trusted his ability to protect her. He helped her onto the back of the bike, showing her how to hold on, how to lean with him through the turns. He started the engine, the roar echoing in the confined space, a sound that was both exhilarating and terrifying. They sped through the darkened streets, the wind whipping past them, the city lights blurring into a hazy glow. They were fugitives, hunted by both the police and the Salernos, their fate hanging in the balance. Alessandro drove with a focused intensity, his eyes scanning the road ahead, his body tense, his senses on high alert. Gianna held onto him tightly, her arms wrapped around his waist, her body pressed against his back. She could feel the strength of his muscles, the warmth of his skin, the steady beat of his heart. She felt a sense of freedom, of exhilaration, but also a deep sense of fear, of uncertainty. She didn't know where they were going, what the future held, but she knew that she was with the man she loved, the man who had risked everything to protect her. As they drove, Gianna thought about the events of the night, about the violence, the betrayal, the choices they had made. She thought about her father, about his legacy, about the world she had been born into. She thought about Alessandro, about his complexities, about his contradictions, about the love that had blossomed between them in the midst of chaos. She realized that they were at a crossroads, a turning point in their lives. They could continue to run, to hide, to live in the shadows. Or they could turn and face their enemies, fight for their freedom, for their future, for their love. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice raised above the roar of the engine. Alessandro glanced back at her, his eyes meeting hers in the rear-view mirror. "To a safe place," he said. "A place where we can regroup, plan our next move." He didn't elaborate, didn't offer any details. But Gianna trusted him. She knew that he had a plan, a strategy, a way to protect them. They drove for hours, leaving the city behind, heading into the countryside. The sky began to lighten, the first rays of dawn painting the horizon with hues of pink and orange. Finally, they arrived at a small, secluded cabin nestled in the woods, overlooking a tranquil lake. It was a simple place, rustic and unassuming, but it felt like a sanctuary, a refuge from the storm. "This is where we'll stay," Alessandro said, his voice soft.
For now.
He helped her off the bike, his hands lingering on hers, his eyes searching hers. They stood there, for a moment, in silence, the only sound the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. The crossroads of fate and forgiveness lay behind them, in the choices they had made, in the actions they had taken. But the path ahead, while uncertain, was now illuminated by a shared purpose, a shared love. "Thank you," Gianna said, her voice trembling.
For everything.
Alessandro smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. "We're in this together," he said. "Always." He opened the cabin door, and as Gianna stepped inside, a thought, sharp and unsettling, pierced through the calm. This was too easy. Who owned this cabin? And how had Alessandro known about it? Chapter 17. The Heart's Uncharted Territory. The cabin was small but cozy, with a rustic charm that soothed Gianna's frayed nerves. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, promising warmth and comfort. Simple wooden furniture, worn smooth with age, filled the main room, and a small kitchenette occupied a corner. A single bedroom, visible through an open doorway, held a large bed covered with a handmade quilt. It felt lived in. Alessandro moved with a familiarity that both reassured and unsettled Gianna. He quickly built a fire, the crackling flames chasing away the morning chill and filling the cabin with a warm, inviting glow. He found coffee and made a pot, the aroma mingling with the scent of wood smoke, creating a sense of normalcy, of domesticity, that was almost surreal, given their circumstances. "Whose cabin is this?" Gianna asked, finally breaking the silence, her voice echoing slightly in the small space. Alessandro hesitated, his gaze shifting, his body tensing slightly. It was a fleeting reaction, almost imperceptible, but Gianna noticed it. "It belonged to my grandfather," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "He used it as a retreat, a place to get away from the city, from the business." Gianna nodded, accepting his explanation, but a nagging feeling of unease persisted. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still holding something back, that there were still secrets between them. They drank their coffee in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Gianna thought about the future, about the challenges they faced, about the uncertain path ahead. She thought about Alessandro, about his complexities, about his contradictions, about the love she felt for him, a love that was both exhilarating and terrifying. After a while, Alessandro spoke, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "Gianna," he said, "I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you. But I want you to know I love you. I love you more than anything in the world." His words, spoken with such sincerity, such vulnerability, melted away the last vestiges of her doubt, of her anger. She reached out, her hand touching his, her fingers intertwining with his. "I love you too, Alessandro," she said, her voice trembling. But she hesitated, unsure how to express the questions that still lingered in her mind. "But what?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "But I need to know everything," she said. "No more secrets. No more lies. I need to know that I can trust you completely." Alessandro nodded, his gaze unwavering.
"You can," he said.
"I promise you. There are no more secrets. Ask me anything." Gianna took a deep breath, steeling herself. "The phone call," she said. "The night of the attack, who called the police?" Alessandro's face paled. He looked away, his body tensing again. This was it, the final test, the final hurdle. "It was Isabella," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Gianna felt a jolt of shock, of disbelief. "Isabella?" she repeated.
"But why?"
Alessandro sighed, his shoulders slumping, as if a great weight had been lifted from him. She doesn't trust you," he said. "She thinks you're a liability, a weakness. She believes that you'll betray us, that you'll lead the Salernos to us." Gianna felt a surge of anger, of indignation. "That's ridiculous,"
she said.
"I would never." "I know," Alessandro said, his voice soothing. "I know you wouldn't. But Isabella, she's been through a lot. She's seen a lot of betrayal. She doesn't trust easily." He explained that Isabella had been acting on her own, without his knowledge, without his consent. She had been trying to protect him, to protect the family, in her own twisted way. Gianna listened, her anger slowly fading, replaced by a grudging understanding. She could see it from Isabella's perspective, could understand her fear, her suspicion. But it still hurt. It still felt like a betrayal, a violation of trust. The heart's uncharted territory, she was discovering, was filled with treacherous currents and hidden reefs. And navigating it required a courage she wasn't sure she possessed. She looked out the window at the tranquil lake, the serene beauty a stark contrast to the turbulent emotions swirling within her. Chapter 18. Echoes of the past, whispers of the future. The revelation about Isabella's actions cast a long shadow over the fragile peace that Gianna and Alessandro had found in the secluded cabin. While Alessandro's explanation had been logical, and Gianna understood Isabella's motivations, the knowledge that his sister distrusted her so deeply created a new layer of complexity in their already precarious situation. They spent the next few days in a state of quiet reflection, trying to process the events that had transpired, trying to figure out their next move. Alessandro spent hours on the phone, speaking in hushed tones in Italian, his face grim, his body tense. Gianna, feeling increasingly isolated, occupied herself with exploring the surrounding woods, finding solace in the tranquility of nature, in the beauty of the lake, in the silence that was broken only by the sounds of birds and the wind rustling through the trees. One afternoon, while walking along the shore of the lake, Gianna stumbled upon a small, overgrown cemetery hidden amongst the trees. It was an old cemetery with weathered headstones and crumbling mausoleums, a place where the past seemed to linger in the air. She wandered through the cemetery, reading the inscriptions on the headstones, the names and dates of people who had lived and died long ago. She felt a sense of connection to these people, to their lives, to their stories, to the echoes of the past that resonated in this quiet, forgotten place. She came across a large mausoleum, more imposing than the others, with the name de Rossi engraved above the entrance. She realized that this was the family mausoleum, the final resting place of Alessandro's ancestors, of her father, of generations of de Rossis who had lived and died by the code. She entered the mausoleum, her heart pounding in her chest. The interior was cool and dark, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. She saw the rows of marble tombs, each bearing the name of a de Rossi, each a testament to the family's long and complicated history. She found her father's tomb, a simple, unadorned slab of marble with his name and dates engraved on it. She stood there for a long time, looking at the tomb, her emotions a mixture of grief, anger, regret, and a strange sense of peace. She realized that she had finally come to terms with her father's death, with his legacy, with the world he had inhabited. She had forgiven him for his flaws, for his mistakes, for the choices he had made. And she had forgiven herself for running away, for abandoning her family, for trying to escape her past. As she was leaving the mausoleum, she heard a voice, a familiar voice, calling her name. She turned, her heart skipping a beat. It was Alessandro. He was standing at the entrance to the cemetery, his face etched with worry. "Gianna," he said, his voice soft. "I was looking for you. Are you all right?" She nodded, her eyes meeting his.
"I'm fine," she said.
"I just needed some time to think." He came closer, his hand reaching out to touch her arm.
"I understand," he said.
"This place, it holds a lot of memories." They walked back to the cabin together, in silence, their hands clasped, a connection restored, a trust deepened. The echoes of the past, once a source of pain and confusion, now seemed to offer a sense of clarity, of perspective. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Alessandro spoke, his voice filled with a newfound determination. "We can't stay here forever," he said. "We need to decide what we're going to do." Gianna nodded, her gaze meeting his. "I know," she said. "And I'm ready. Whatever we decide, we'll do it together." He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. "We'll face them," he said. "The Salernos, Isabella, anyone who stands in our way. We'll fight for our future, for our love." He outlined his plan, to use the evidence he and Sofia had gathered to expose the Salernos' corruption, to bring them down, once and for all. It was a risky plan, a dangerous plan, but it was their only chance. And Gianna, standing at his side, was no longer afraid. The whispers of the future, once filled with uncertainty and fear, now held a note of hope, of defiance, of a love that had been tested, but not broken. But a crucial question remained. How would they deal with Isabella? Chapter 19. A symphony of chaos and courage. Alessandro's plan was audacious, a carefully orchestrated symphony of chaos designed to dismantle the Salerno Empire from within. He planned to use the evidence he and Sofia had gathered to expose the Salerno's network of corrupt officials, to cripple their operations, and to ultimately bring them to justice. It was a dangerous gambit, requiring precise timing, unwavering courage, and a degree of luck. The first step was to contact Sofia, to coordinate their efforts, to ensure that they were both working towards the same goal. Alessandro used a secure communication channel, a coded message sent through a trusted intermediary, to reach out to her. The response was swift and affirmative. Sofia was ready. The next step was to leak the evidence to the right people, to journalists, to law enforcement agencies, to individuals who could expose the Salerno's crimes and bring them to justice. Alessandro had carefully cultivated contacts over the years, individuals who were trustworthy, who were willing to fight corruption, who were not afraid of the Salernos. Gianna, initially hesitant, found herself drawn into the intricate planning, her sharp mind and organizational skills proving invaluable. She helped Alessandro organize the evidence, categorize the documents, and prepare the presentations that would be used to expose the Salerno's network. She was no longer a passive bystander, but an active participant, a partner in this dangerous dance. The most difficult part of the plan was dealing with Isabella. Alessandro knew that his sister would be a formidable obstacle, that her distrust of Gianna, her loyalty to the old ways, would make her a dangerous enemy. He had to find a way to neutralize her, to convince her to join them, or at least, to stay out of their way. He decided to confront her directly, to meet with her face to face, to explain his plan, to appeal to her sense of family, of loyalty, of justice. It was a risky move, but he believed it was the only way. He arranged a meeting with Isabella at a neutral location, a small, unassuming restaurant in a quiet neighborhood. Gianna insisted on accompanying him, despite his protests. She knew that she had to face Isabella, to prove her loyalty, to show her that she was not a threat. The meeting was tense, fraught with unspoken emotions. Isabella, her face cold and unyielding, her eyes filled with suspicion, listened to Alessandro's explanation with barely concealed contempt. She didn't trust Gianna, didn't believe in Alessandro's plan, didn't believe that they could win. "You're a fool, Alessandro," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You're risking everything for this woman. She'll betray you, just like all the others." Gianna stepped forward, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "I will not betray him," she said. "I love him, and I believe in what he's doing." Isabella looked at Gianna, her eyes searching hers, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the silence hung heavy in the air, the tension almost unbearable. Then, to everyone's surprise, Isabella smiled, a slow, chilling smile. Perhaps I was wrong about you," she said. "Perhaps you are a Darasi after all." She agreed to help them, to use her own contacts, her own resources, to support their plan. But she made it clear that she was doing it for Alessandro, for the family, not for Gianna. The symphony of chaos had begun. The evidence was leaked, the media erupted, the authorities launched investigations. The Salerno Empire began to crumble, its foundations shaken, its secrets exposed. The courage of a few, fueled by love and a thirst for justice, was challenging the entrenched power of a corrupt system. But the final movement of this symphony was yet to be played, and its outcome remained uncertain. The air crackled with anticipation, with danger, with the promise of a final, decisive confrontation. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The release of the evidence triggered a chain reaction, a cascade of events that brought the Salerno Empire crashing down. Arrests were made, indictments were handed down, and the corrupt officials who had protected the Salernos for years were exposed and disgraced. The media frenzy was intense, the public outcry deafening. The Salernos, once untouchable, were now vulnerable, their power shattered, their empire in ruins. But the Salernos, even in their weakened state, were not going to go down without a fight. Antonio Salerno, the head of the family, the man who had ordered Gianna's father's death, was still at large. He was a desperate man, a cornered animal, and he was determined to take revenge on those who had brought him down. He knew that Alessandro and Gianna were the key players, the driving force behind his downfall. He sent his remaining loyalists to hunt them down, to eliminate them, to silence them forever. Alessandro, Gianna, and Isabella, anticipating this move, had prepared for a final confrontation. They had gathered their allies, their resources, their courage. They were ready to fight, to defend themselves, to end this once and for all. The final confrontation took place at the Darasi family estate, the same place where Gianna's father had ruled, the same place where she had spent her childhood, the same place where the feud with the Salernos had begun. It was a fitting setting, a symbolic battleground, where the past and the present would collide. The battle was fierce, brutal, and relentless. Gunfire echoed through the halls, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Alessandro, Gianna, and Isabella fought side by side, their love, their loyalty, their courage a shield against the hatred that surrounded them. Gianna, no longer the frightened florist, fought with a ferocity she never knew she possessed. She was protecting her love, her future, her life. She was a Darasi, and she would not be defeated. Isabella, fighting alongside Alessandro and Gianna, finally saw the truth, the strength, the loyalty that Gianna possessed. Her distrust, her suspicion, melted away, replaced by a grudging respect, a newfound understanding. In the midst of the chaos, Alessandro confronted Antonio Salerno. The two men, locked in a deadly embrace, faced each other, their eyes filled with hatred, with a lifetime of animosity. "This ends here, Salerno," Alessandro said, his voice cold and steady. "You may have won this battle," Bellini Salerno hissed, "but you will never win the war. The Salernos will never be defeated." Suddenly, a shot rang out, a single, decisive shot. Antonio Salerno stumbled, his eyes widening in disbelief, his body slumping to the ground. He was dead. But the shot had not come from Alessandro's gun. It had come from Isabella. She stood there, her gun still smoking, her face pale but resolute. "It's over," she said, her voice trembling. "It's finally over." The remaining Salerno loyalists, seeing their leader dead, surrendered, their will to fight broken. The battle was over. The war was over. The feud was over. Alessandro and Gianna embraced, their bodies shaking, their emotions overwhelming. They had survived. They had won. They had found their freedom, their future, their love. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties had ended, not in a bloodbath of vengeance, but in a fragile, hard-won peace. A peace forged in courage, in forgiveness, and in the unwavering power of love. The echoes of gunfire faded, replaced by the quiet sobs of relief, of grief, of a new beginning. Epilogue. The dust settled. The De Rossi estate, once a symbol of power and violence, was slowly transformed into a place of healing and renewal. Alessandro, with Gianna by his side, worked to dismantle the remnants of the criminal empire, using his knowledge and influence to help the authorities bring the remaining corrupt officials to justice. He severed ties with the mafia underworld, renouncing the violence, the code, the legacy of his family. Isabella, her heart softened by the events of the final confrontation, reconciled with Alessandro and Gianna. She finally accepted Gianna, not just as Alessandro's love, but as a member of the family, a woman of strength and courage. She dedicated her life to using her skills and resources to help those who had been harmed by the mafia, seeking redemption for her past actions. Gianna, finally free from the shadows of her past, returned to her love of flowers. She reopened her flower shop, Fiori di Gianna, transforming it into a haven of beauty and peace, a symbol of her new life. She used her experiences, her knowledge of the dark underworld, to help others, to offer support and guidance to those who were trying to escape violence and abuse. Alessandro and Gianna, their love tested and strengthened by the trials they had endured, built a life together, a life filled with love, with laughter, with peace. They honored the memory of their parents, of their families, but they also forged their own path, creating a new legacy, a legacy of hope, of forgiveness, of redemption. They often visited the small, secluded cabin in the woods, the place where they had found refuge, the place where their love had truly blossomed. They would sit by the lake, hand in hand, watching the sunset, remembering the past, but also looking forward to the future. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Gianna turned to Alessandro, her eyes filled with love. "We did it," she said, her voice soft. "We finally found our peace." Alessandro smiled, his hand gently caressing her cheek.
"We did," he said.
"And we did it together." Years later, Gianna and Alessandro stood in the renovated gardens of the De Rossi estate, now a community center offering support and resources to victims of violence. Children played on the grass, their laughter echoing through the air, a stark contrast to the gunshots that had once rung out in this very place. Gianna, her hair streaked with silver, held a small bouquet of blood-red roses, their velvety petals soft beneath her fingertips. She looked at Alessandro, his eyes, the color of deep-sea slate, still holding the same intensity, the same love that had captivated her all those years ago. The scar on his jaw, a reminder of his past, seemed to have faded, softened by time and by the healing power of love. They had built a new legacy, a legacy of hope, of forgiveness, of a love that had conquered all. And as they stood there, surrounded by the beauty they had created, they knew that their journey, though fraught with danger and heartache, had been worth it. They had found their peace, their happiness, their forever, in each other's arms. The scent of roses, no longer mingled with gunpowder, filled the air, a sweet, fragrant testament to their enduring love. The end.